Welcome to this week's 3 at 3, where we are talking about data's role in transformation. And we have a special guest today, which my partner in crime, Steve Plummer, is going to introduce.
I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Alan Crawley, who is the Chief Exec of Optima Partners. Optima Partners are a customer consultancy specializing in customer transformation and data sciences. And I guess the first question that I have for you, Alan, is why are we even talking about data?
Hi both. So I think it's a really interesting question to start because on the one hand, data is the foundation of pretty much everything we do, and yet there's so much talked about data governance, data problems, data compliance. It feels often like something that we have to get hold of and tackle, rather than something that is inspiring and something that's going to open up opportunity. So I think it's absolutely right to table a question around so why are we even bothering with this? And the answer is because it's everywhere, and the discussion is absolutely everywhere. There are a myriad of technology companies that are promoting their view of the world of data. There are a myriad of startup companies selling their particular take on data, and everybody's very familiar with things like the Internet of Things, which I'm sure everybody's heard about. The idea that your fridge gathers data about the way that you interact with your fridge, the way that your smart meter gathers data about the way that you utilize energy in your home. Electric vehicles gather a vast amount of data about the way that you use the vehicle, the way that the batteries utilized, and so on. So we're surrounded and engulfed almost in an absolute sea of data that's often really difficult to make sense of. So I think the pertinent question is we're bothering to talk about data because data is everywhere, and data is something we can't ignore, that we need to pay special attention to. We need to think about how we organize and structure it, and how we organize ourselves to make best use of it in order to drive change. And change can be in a variety of different formats. It could be big strategic change with new products and services. It could be operational change with how better to reduce costs and be more cost efficient in the way that we operate our companies, our organizations. And then on a very micro level, the specific moments that we want to use data in order to, for example, personalize our services or interactions with customers.
So do you think, Andy, that data and usage of data can actually drive companies towards innovation and change?
Very much so. So if you, and actually we've done quite a lot of work recently with in the telecommunications sector to create a model, a framework for doing this. So the idea is that that data can drive innovation at different levels of detail. So like I said earlier on, if we want to think about how we optimize an interaction with a customer, on the one hand, we could approach it purely from a customer experience standpoint, which is all centered around what is it we're trying to achieve for that customer at that point of interaction. The value of data in, if you like, transforming that into another level is to help us understand the context in which, say, that conversation's taking place. So we can think about data being used in wrappers, if you will, at a particular moment in time. So the way that we interact with a bank, with an airline, or in an online retailing session, we can use data to dramatically improve the quality of that interaction, that experience, by making sure that we understand the context. Interestingly, that extends even to, I guess people might not think of it in this way, but the data that we gather in a session of itself is valuable. So there are technologies that will track eye movement, so we can see where somebody's looking at on the screen. There are technologies that will track mouse movements. There are some companies that will interpret that in the context of how the customer is feeling at the time, therefore how likely they are as a result of that to not necessarily to buy something, but to behave in a certain way. So there are numerous ways of using data in that kind of transformative sense. So that's just a micro example.
Yeah, and my experience for the last 15 years is that often data is the last thing to get thought about in a project.
Yeah.
You know, we tend to think all about, you know, all the other technologies, the processes, who's going to be impacted, we do our user journeys and all of that kind of stuff. And then at the end, somebody goes, oh yeah, we need to think about data, or we need MI. That's the other one. You know, you get really poor MI requirements, and that's about as far as the data analysis goes. Until you get into the point of going, right, well, are we validating some data? And that's maybe as good as it gets. So from your perspective, how should we ensure that data can be used effectively and efficiently within organizations?
So the best way to answer that, I think, is to kind of break that down from top level down. So if you think about, I don't know, launching a new product or service, then to your point, we often think about exactly what the products or services is likely to be, and there's a whole range of tools and techniques that people use to adopt that. But we also need to think very carefully about what information is being generated by the transactions around that product or service. We need to think very carefully about where we store that information. We need to think very carefully about the relationship between elements of data together, describe person, customer, if you will, the service, the transactions, and so on. So there's a great deal of effort and work that needs to go into understanding that level of detail. My background is predominantly in marketing, so we use data all the time in marketing. And your point, Angela, about it's often the last thing that we think about. But it takes me years back to working in the direct marketing industry. So we would often talk about, or our creative colleagues talk about running a particular type of campaign, and those of us sitting in the dark bowels of the building hacking the data together, we're often the last people to find out about it. So you're absolutely right. It's not as common as it used to be, but it's still, it's still the case. So we need to think about data in a strategic sense. I'll give an example in a second of the power of that, or why it's so important. So, and then we need to break that down into what kinds of, what processes is that data supporting, and that can be a range of different things. We need to think in terms of how we store that. Is it compliant? Are we governing it properly? Are we attentive to the regulatory requirements and so on? It's the whole level of detail that we need to think about around that. And we need to, right up front, think about how we measure performance. So we're measuring performance not only of the outcomes that we're looking for, could be buy something or consumer service capability in a particular way, but also the way in which the environment is operating. Is the environment operating well? And in order to measure those things, we obviously need the data to do that. And the data to do that needs to be organized and structured in a particular way in order to make sure that we are able to pull out the information that we want. Give you a very quick example of why it's so important at a strategic level to get this right. So one of our clients in the energy sector fairly recently has made a decision to transfer from one marketing platform to another marketing platform. It's quite a common thing to do. And when we were initially working with them, we made a big thing about, we can replace software relatively easily, but what's really difficult to replace is the data infrastructure that sits beneath it, that powers it, if you will. And so we invested very heavily, the client invested very heavily in making sure that they had the right data architecture and that they had it well designed and well configured, and they did a great job. Recently, they've had to make this move from one application platform to another application platform, and it's relatively straightforward to do.
Yep.
If we had to re-engineer all the data infrastructure, it would be very difficult, very expensive, and would take an awful long time. So it's just an interesting example of one thing was better for them, but it's made easy by the investment they made in the data.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I worked with a water utility a couple of years back, and their initial driver was to do exactly that, to move platforms. and our work showed that actually, whilst that was probably the right thing to do, they didn't have their data infrastructure in anywhere near a ready, fit state to do so. And so, you know, the kind of the strategy, if you will, was to spend time and invest time and effort to get your data into the situation that you could move it.
Yeah.
And the end result of that actually was that by refining their data structure, it transpired that it was the data structure that was the issue and not the platform. So we ended up saving the money because they ended up not having to then invest in the big platform that they were going to move to, and ended up combining their billing system and their CRM together in a much more graceful way because the data was actually set up in the way that it needed to be. And I come across this all the time when you're doing big digital transformation road mapping and strategic thinking for clients. They often come and say, our CRM's not working, or the billing engine doesn't do what we need it to do, or we're not getting the right customer experience, or whatever. They rarely focus in on, well, how's your data set up, and is the infrastructure and the layering of your data in the right place to enable you to do all of these really achievable things. And it's such an interesting area.
Yeah, and to your point, Steve, the being really clear about what you need to do. So in our language, we talk about jobs to be done. So what jobs are you trying to do with the data? Being really clear about that right from the outset. And just to the point you made earlier on around, you know, there are different levels of job to be done with data, and being as clear as you possibly can be about that will help you to understand what you need and how you need to structure and store it. But there's absolutely no question that getting that right, it's such a good investment, because getting that right makes everything else you need to do so much easier. And
therefore less costly.
Yeah, less costly, and also enables innovation. So if your biggest struggle is, I mean, I've been involved in service design-based projects, design thinking-led projects, where we haven't used any data other than ethnographic studies, which is completely fine. I thought that, you know, that's nothing wrong with that at all. But what we weren't doing was looking at the kind of, as it were, the foundational data that the organizations we were dealing with had to describe and help to explain the way people actually behave. So you're just missing such a big part of the story if you don't use those assets.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Andy. That's been really insightful for us. That is us out of time for this week's V at 3.
Okay.
So we will see everyone next week with a new topic. But yes, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Andy. And I'll say goodbye for today.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alan. See you later.
Bye.